Good morning, it's Andy Stautz at Stautz Law. It's Casual Friday here again. Recording another talk just after the last one, and it is still 95 degrees. Today we are talking about preliminary inventories, which is an important first step in administering a probate estate. So to begin with, the personal representative is the person in charge of administering a deceased person's estate. The decedent's estate is all of their property. All of their property, I should say, that is titled solely in their name at time of death. We've discussed earlier and elsewhere the difference between probate and non-probate assets. But here's the situation, and here's where the preliminary inventory comes up. First, when you file your application, your petition to be appointed personal representative, on the filing, there's a section where you say, this is my name, here's why I'm suited to be a personal representative. There's also, we think the estate is solvent, more assets than liabilities, more positives than negatives, if that's true. And then you also say, here's a preliminary inventory, just like a very preliminary, like here's what we think we're dealing with here. So that's the first most informal preliminary inventory. And sometimes I leave those blank. Sometimes, I'm preparing the petition for my clients and I say, we don't know, to be determined. Other times, especially if there's a question of the court ordering a bond, like we talked about last week, I'll say, the only thing in this estate is this little house and a small bank account. Because if you can reassure the court that the estate isn't that big, they're more likely not to order a bond. We talked about that the other week. So sometimes you put something there, sometimes you say, yet to be determined. The real preliminary inventory has to be filed soon after the court appoints the personal representative and the letters of administration or the letters testamentary are issued. So, your first step is to figure out what's out there, what the probate assets are, and the values at the time of death. So for some things, that's easy. If there's a bank account, you look back at the statements and you say, okay, well, it was, there's this much. For some things, like a house, it's a little harder. It's like, well, it's assessed at this, Zillow says this, but you're supposed to go through all of it. And personal property too, furniture, $1,000, bank account, $30,000, house, $140,000. So the preliminary inventory is your master list. Here's what we started with. And it's important to get it right because later when you go to close the estate, supervised or not, you need to tell the court, here's what happened to the stuff. Here's where everything went. We paid out this much in creditor claims. We had this much expenses for taxes and attorney fees. We distributed the remainder. You have to account for every dollar. And the preliminary inventory is your starting point. So it makes sense when you think about it that way. It's like, okay, we need to set the start so that we can track it over the administration of the estate, and then we can account for it all at the end. A common question I get, though, is, wait a minute, there's one beneficiary here. Do we need to appraise the house? Do we need to go get a professional appraiser? Or, two beneficiaries and they get along and they say, do we really need to know what the furniture is worth? And the answer there is not really. I mean, it's okay. If there's going to be a conflict, you want precise values. But otherwise, it's okay to use an estimate for some of those if it's less contentious and less important. Nobody's going to tell you, spend $1,000 to get a professional appraiser's opinion of the clothes, which together are, less than $1,000. It just doesn't make sense. So sometimes estimates are okay, and sometimes saying, our realtor tells us we could probably sell the house for this. you need some basis for the valuation. And if it's a supervised estate, the court needs to approve it. But you don't necessarily need to go like, to the penny, this is what we'd get at auction. So that's there's kind of realism there. You need to use some judgment in terms of how precisely you need to pin down those values. But like I said, you need to account for everything at the end. So you can't, you're kind of stuck with what you started with. You don't want to suddenly change your mind about, the value of different items. You also don't want to miss items. So some of it's detective work. You're supposed to go through the decedent's files and say, okay, well, here's what we think they owned. You look at the tax returns. Oh, they got interest income from this. We didn't know about that. You got to go find things, and you've got a pretty quick time to do it. We'll talk more. This video is getting long, so I'll talk more about the verification of the inventory in the next video. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.